In Genesis 22, when Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac, Genesis just has God giving him that order, go to this place, sacrifice your son. Well, Jubilees puts this figure Mastema in there, that he's the one who really gave the idea, raised the challenge to God. Does Abraham serve you for nothing, like Job? I think what the writer is doing and wants people to accept is to say, this is the way you have to read Genesis. You've got to understand it in the right way. And I'm going to tell you how to do that.
Genesis 1 describes the first 7 days in the book of Jubilees. And then their interpretation of Genesis 2 is another 7 days of some type of creation. Is that right? Everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with Dr. VanderKam. We're going to be talking about the book of Jubilees. I don't know how do you forget that? We're going to be talking about the book of Jubilees and its significance, what it talks about. It says to be inspired by God, written down by Moses, but it says a lot of different things compared to what we typically see as, Exodus and Genesis. So, Dr. VanderKam, how are you doing today? Can you give us a little bit about your background on the topic?
Okay. I think the first time I read the book of Jubilees was in about 1972 or something like that. So about 50 years ago. And it right away struck me as really an interesting book. I was reading other books written, say, between the Old and New Testaments at the time, because that period interested me a great deal. But this book seemed different from the other ones in the sense that it was a narrative. I've always liked narratives and stories. And it's also a book that tells a familiar story, the story we know from Genesis and Exodus, from creation to the time when Moses and Israel arrived at Mount Sinai. And the book is quite long. It's probably about as long as the book of Genesis, maybe even longer than that. But it's well preserved, so we have the whole thing, which is not always the case for literature from that time. And it just gave a different perspective on those stories in Genesis and in Exodus. And it struck me as a fascinating example of how people were reading Genesis and Exodus way back at this time, say 150, 160 years before the birth of Christ. So I did the things I needed to learn how to read the book. The book is preserved completely only in the classical language of Ethiopia, interestingly enough. Jubilees was translated a couple of times in antiquity, and it just happens to be preserved fully only in the ancient Ethiopic language. So I studied that so I would be able to read the book, and learned whatever I could about the period in which it seemed likely that it was written. So I did this after I had graduated from theological seminary. I had a Fulbright scholarship for a year, which I spent at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And there I studied this period between the Testaments and familiarized myself with the book of Enoch and the book of Jubilees, and studied hard on the languages that would be involved. And then I did my PhD at Harvard, where I could also continue that kind of language study and work with people who were very well trained in this particular field. And I ended up writing a dissertation on the book of Jubilees, which I defended in 1976, and it was published in 1977. And I've been working on the book ever since. And I continue to find it fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really awesome book, and you're definitely the person to talk to. I say that you've got a wide range of books, just so people can, if they want to learn more in advance, what would you say is some things they can check out about your work?
The two most widely available things I've written, I believe, are a book about the period we're talking about and a book about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Um, I wrote a book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Today. The first edition of it came out in 1994, which was a pretty interesting time in the history of studying the scrolls. It was a time when there was all kinds of public controversy about how many of them had not been published some 40 or more years after they had been discovered.
Wow.
And so I was involved in publishing some Dead Sea Scrolls, and this was a book really to give people an overview of that subject, especially at a time when there were conspiracy theories about different groups trying to suppress the contents of the scrolls. One popular thing among some people was that the Vatican somehow was suppressing what was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was total nonsense. But
Uh-huh.
people sold a lot of books telling stories like
Wow.
that. So I tried to do a straightforward, what I took to be quite a sensible approach to the scrolls, and published it in that book. And a second edition of that book came out in, I think it was 2012, The Dead Sea Scrolls Today. The other book is an introduction to early Judaism, early Judaism being a term for this time between the Testaments. This too, like the Dead Sea Scrolls Today, was published by Erdman's in Grand Rapids. And the second edition of that book came out, I believe it was in 2020. That's an overview giving a history of the period, a survey of the literature written by Jewish people at that time, and also a summary of some of the main ideas that come to expression in the Jewish literature from that time. So maybe those two books give the best idea of the sorts of things I've been doing.
Yeah, you also have an entire commentary on the Book of Jubilees, which I found helpful preparing for this. The if you were to give like a 5-minute summary of the Book of Jubilees, how would you describe that? What would you say?
Well, I'd say this. If you pick up the book of Jubilees and you know Genesis and Exodus, and this will be true for a lot of people, it's great fun to read because, keeping in mind what you know from Genesis and Exodus, you can then compare what you get in this book. This book of Jubilees, in the first chapter, tells us that at the time when Moses went up Mount Sinai for his first 40-day stay on the mountain, he spoke with God for those 40 days. And God tells to Moses at this time, when they've just made the covenant, God has made the covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. The very next day, God tells Moses, these people are going to go astray. And they're going to continue this for a long, long time. And finally, I'm going to send them into exile. They'll repent there, and then they'll come back, and I'll be with them, and so on. And Moses argues with God and says, oh, come on. Why don't you make Israel into a different kind of people so they won't be so wicked and stiff-necked and so on? And God says, no, it's going to work out this way. And then God says to an angel of the presence, an angel who serves right in God's presence, you dictate to Moses from heavenly tablets. So this angel has to just read to Moses from the heavenly tablets all the stuff that's found in the rest of the book. And the rest of the book looks a lot like Genesis and the first half of Exodus. It starts with a story of creation, and it continues with Adam and Eve, and then going on to the flood, and then to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob is especially an important person in this book, and on into the stories of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. So all of that is, should be familiar to people who know their Bibles well. But what you notice very soon when you are reading Jubilees is that the author often offers more than you have in Genesis or Exodus. There are additional materials there. For example, there's the story of creation, which will sound somewhat familiar, although it's worded differently than it is in Genesis 1 or 2. It incorporates material from both of those. But at the end of that account of creation, where in Genesis it says, the seventh day God rested and hallowed it, and so on. In Jubilees, it says there's a long section about the Sabbath. Genesis doesn't actually use the word Sabbath there. It uses the verb for stopping, ceasing from work. But Jubilees elaborates on the importance of the Sabbath at great length and how Jacob and his descendants will keep the Sabbath and so on. So Jacob and his descendants, Israel, are mentioned already in that creation account. It goes on for verse after verse after verse. So this is quite in addition to what we have in Genesis. And that sort of thing recurs throughout the book. When we get to the story of Noah and the flood, at the end of it, the author includes an explanation of the calendar, of the annual calendar, that in a solar year there are 364 days, and how important this is to observe a year of that length so that the festivals are celebrated at the proper time, and so on. In that vein, it goes on. But the careful reader who knows the Bible will also notice that some things get left out of the story in Jubilees. And often the things that are left out are embarrassing episodes for one of the patriarchs, like a patriarch lying about who his wife was. Abram lies about Sarai when he's in Egypt. These things are left out, making it pretty clear that the writer wants to burnish their characters, make them look a little better. Actually, I think more boring than they are in Genesis. They're pretty interesting characters in Genesis. So additions to what we have in Genesis and Exodus, and also subtractions from it. But the whole account leads up to the time at Mount Sinai and the promise that they'll enter the land in 40 more years. So it'll look familiar to people who know the Bible and strange at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. There in when I was reading through it, there's these. It's like the year of Jubilees. I think it is like all throughout the book. Like it's kind of like how it dates it. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you
One
talk
of the
about that? Like what that is it like actually trying to give like some kind of chronology, or how do you even calculate the date from that?
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that you'll notice when you read Jubilees is that the writer dates so many events that in the book of Genesis and Exodus do not have any dates attached to them. There really is, for most of Genesis, not a very easy to follow chronology. But Jubilees dates all of these events, and as you indicated, it uses a system for dating events that has to do with the Jubilee, and hence the name of the Book of Jubilees. For the writer, a Jubilee lasts 49 years. He takes the term to refer to a period of 49 years, 7 times 7. So every Jubilee period of 49 years has what the writer calls 7 weeks of years in the 49 years, and so on. So he dates things by the week of the year, the week in which something happens, and often the year within the week, and so on. Usually you think of the Jubilee as a year, a special year at the end of a 49-year period. But for this writer, it's 49 years. So he goes through that whole chronology, dating many events from creation until Moses and the Israelites are at Mount Sinai, which he says is in the year 2410 from creation, and tells you that in the number of Jubilee periods, 49 Jubilee periods and some few more years. Now, it seems like a clumsy system, and I think that in some cases the dates kind of got mixed up in the manuscript tradition, but Anyway, he goes through all these events, dating them, telling you it happened in this Jubilee, in this week of years, and in this year. And you can, just using basic math, you can figure out what year from creation he's talking about. But at the end of the book, the writer says, well, okay, it's been 49 of these Jubilee periods and a few more years, year 2410. And there are 40 more years until you enter the land. In other words, a total of 50 Jubilee periods is what it's going to be. So in the 50th Jubilee period, Israel will enter the promised land. And by doing that, the writer actually makes a pretty profound theological point, indicating that he's not doing all of this chronological calculation just because he likes to do figures and confuse readers. But in the Jubilee year, according to the Bible, two things happen. Israelite slaves are supposed to be released, and land is returned to its original owners. That's what happens in the 50th year of the Jubilee year, according to Leviticus, for example. Jubilee says that in the 50th Jubilee period, the 50th of these 49-year periods, the Israelite slaves are released from Egypt in the Exodus, and they get to the promised land, which, according to Jubilees, is really belonged to them in the first place. It was land given to their great ancestor Shem, the son of Noah, but it was stolen by the Canaanites, who shouldn't have been there. And this is one of the additions Jubilees has to Genesis, that Canaan, this grandson of Noah, who gets cursed in Genesis, that he did not go to the territory that his father Noah had assigned to him in dividing up the earth, but he saw the land of Canaan and really liked it and stole it from the descendants of Shem. So the Israelites, when they were going back to Canaan, were not conquerors invading the land, according to Jubilees. They were just reclaiming their rightful land. So in this 50th Jubilee period, the Israelite slaves are released from Egypt, and they get back their rightful land, the land that had been promised to them. So I think it shows that the author knows about this idea that the Jubilee is a 50th of something, a 50th period. So because the key Jubilee is the one in which the Israelite slaves are released and they reclaim their land. But for the most part, he uses the term for a 49-year period. And it's kind of a sign he likes the number 7. He uses it a lot in the book.
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now?
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. So along those dates, you kind of give a time period essentially of, like, I guess when it calculates, when all this happened or whatever. How does that match up with the Masoretic text and Septuagint as far as those chronologies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Insofar as we can compare them, Jubilees does not exactly agree with any of them. The Masoretic text, that is the traditional Hebrew text, the Septuagint or the Greek translation, and the Samaritan Pentateuch we could put in here also. All of them have different chronologies for the time leading up to the flood, and actually after it as well, in part. But for the time leading up to the flood, it mostly is a matter of the ages of the patriarchs in Genesis 5, these patriarchs from Adam through Noah, so including people like Enoch and Methuselah and so on. Well, you have different ages for them in those different versions of Genesis that you were mentioning. for the time before the flood and leading up to the flood, Jubilees agrees with what we know from the Samaritan version of
Oh,
Genesis,
wow.
not with the Masoretic text or with the Greek translation.
Hmm.
But then after the flood, it goes its own way. It doesn't really follow any of them. It doesn't vary from them a great deal, but it doesn't agree entirely with any of them, which
Wow.
suggests that there were these different chronological traditions around, for that early part of Genesis.
So you said, just to be 100% clear, so you're saying that maybe there was even a separate tradition after the flood of some type of dating of the patriarchs that we don't even have today.
Well, in the time after the flood, we learn, following, let's say, the line of Noah's son Shem, it tells you so and so when he was such an age had a son, and so on. And so we get some chronology that way. But the numbers for the ages of the patriarchs when their son was born don't always agree, or how old they lived to be don't always agree in the different traditions.
Interesting. Very fascinating. Okay. If you were to give well, let's start with dating actually. So you mentioned it was like second century around then. Could you talk about like how we date that? How do we know that it was written around that time period? And is there any debate about that?
Actually, there is debate not about it being written in the second century BC, but about when in that century it might have been written. So the debate is within pretty narrow limits. How do we know the book was written then? We have pretty good evidence, I think. We don't know for sure, but we have pretty good evidence. One piece of evidence is that several copies of the Book of Jubilees in Hebrew were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually 14 of them in all. All of them are very, very damaged. They're very broken up into fragments so that, very little of the text has been preserved. But we have bits and pieces from what presumably were 14 original complete manuscripts of Jubilees in Hebrew. And the oldest one of them was probably copied between, say, about 125 and 100 BC. And we can come to a date like that on the basis of the scribe's handwriting, comparing that with the handwriting in dated documents that we have. So it comes from about that time. So if we have a copy of Jubilees written in, let's say, 120 BC, that already gets us into the second century BC. And there are a couple of other indicators in the book that about its time. The one that's often cited by people is that when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, in Genesis, God clothes them, and so they have to cover their nakedness. And the writer of Jubilees has one of his additions at this point about how important it is that people be clothed and not run around naked and so on. And it's likely that the writer is concerned about this because we know that in about 170 BC, a Greek gymnasium was put up in Jerusalem. And in Greek gymnasiums, athletes performed in the nude. It was just what you did. It's what the word gymnasium means, a place where you do athletic stuff in the nude. And so there was one right in Jerusalem. And so nudity became an issue at that time. And it would be understandable if Jubilees is kind of bent out of shape about nudity, that it would be in reaction to the presence of a gymnasium like that in Jerusalem. So that suggests that it was a lively issue at the time. We don't know of any other time when that was a lively issue before that. So somewhere in there, there are also a lot of connections between Jubilees and the community that had care of the Dead Sea Scrolls. many lines of agreement between them, like with the calendar. So maybe that too is another pointer to some time. It seems to be earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls, but points to a time in the 2nd century. So I think the late 160s, the 150s, something like that, is the most likely time for it.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Okay, so and you kind of talked about the cultural background. Do we have any idea? Is this written? This wasn't written by the people at Qumran, right?
I don't think so. Some people think it was, but I think there are reasons to believe that it wasn't. One reason for thinking that is that Jubilees is very much interested in the whole people of Israel, the whole nation. And its author doesn't give any indication of having a sectarian mentality, which you find in the scrolls. It's a separated group that wrote the scrolls, that own the scrolls. Jubilees doesn't seem to have that sort of thing. So I think it makes best sense to say it was written before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that the Dead Sea Scroll community thought very highly of the Book of Jubilees, had a bunch of copies of it around, and used it, cited it in some of their documents.
Yeah, I was reading in I think it was you who wrote it, that was talking about how they might or probably thought it was inspired. Like it was one text that like essentially put it along with the Torah, I guess. I think it was.
Yes. Well, there's an important document among the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Damascus document by people today, and it cites Jubilees, and it refers to the Torah of Moses, and then it uses a title for Jubilees, the book of the divisions of the times and weeks. And it talks about both of them in the same way, that things are exactly stated in both of them, about legal matters and so on. And it gives you the impression that Jubilees and the Torah of Moses are like each other, being put on somewhat of the same level, it seems like. We also have a reference or two to something from Jubilees that's introduced by a formula, like "it is written." And in the New Testament, for example, that's a way of citing stuff from the Old Testament. It is written, or it stands written that, and then something from the Old Testament will be quoted. Well, Jubilees is referred to in that way a time or two in the scrolls, again suggesting it's written there, so it must be right, is the implication. So they thought very highly of it, I think, probably accepted the claims the book makes for itself.
Wow. But then we do not have as much acceptance of it, right? Like, it's like one specific Christian church or something like that, or area?
Yeah. Maybe this community of the Dead Sea Scrolls regarded it as authoritative. I think it's likely they did. But we don't know of other Jewish groups who did. We do know that some Christians thought highly of it, some early Christians, and used it, could cite it in support of their positions. So there was certainly appreciation for it in Christianity. And one of the uses to which early Christians put it was to kind of fill in the gaps in Genesis and Exodus, where Jubilees has something more than Genesis or Exodus. Christians would take stuff from Jubilees and put it in there. We have some copies of Genesis, for example, that have kind of notes in the margins of Greek manuscripts, and stuff from Jubilees gets quoted there, explaining a couple of passages in Genesis. But eventually Jubilees, which seems to have been translated in Greek, even though we don't have any copies of it, was translated from Greek into the Ethiopic language that I was talking about earlier. And in the Ethiopic Christian Church, the Ethiopic Orthodox Church, it was accepted as part of the Old Testament.
Wow.
And that's why we have copies of it in Ethiopic, in the Ethiopic language, a lot of copies of it.
Because they cared about it more.
Yeah, they did. So
Very,
they
very
preserved it.
fascinating.
Yeah, and we're happy they did.
Yeah, right. Interesting how that is. So, could you talk about you've written a little bit about how they, you know, Genesis, the Torah would have been widely available to these people, but then you have this person, or I don't know, group of people or whatever, that write the Book of Jubilees, and there's kind of like a tension there. It's like, why would they write that if they already had the Torah? Because the Book of Jubilees is supposed to be like, it's claiming to be inspired, but like it's obviously not this other text.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that tension there?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an important problem, and I don't think we really have it all figured out yet. But yeah, the Jubilees, I think, refers to the Torah of Moses. It refers to it as the first law in one case, where the angel is revealing the story about Jacob's daughter Dinah visiting the ladies of Shechem and being raped by the son of the prince of Shechem. When the angel is revealing that story to Moses in Jubilees, he goes over it very quickly, just mentions briefly what happened, whereas it takes up much of a chapter in Genesis 34. And the angel says, I've written about all this stuff in the first law. So that's apparently Genesis. And it makes you think, okay, the writer is aware of Genesis and is not denying it or anything like that. And even admitting, okay, this angel was involved in inspiring that as well, from God. So Jubilees obviously thinks of itself as not Genesis, but it does not at all denigrate Genesis. And I think what the writer is doing and wants people to accept is to say, this is the way you have to read Genesis. You've got to understand it in the right way. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. And I have great authority for doing that because this was revealed to me, the right way to read these stories in Genesis and in Exodus, because I think some people were probably raising all kinds of questions about them at the time the author wrote the book. And the author is quite aware of the kinds of questions they raise because he tries to address them. So maybe he's just saying, I know what Genesis is there, but it's like you need, some Cliff's Notes, or I don't know if people use those anymore, but, some sort of help in reading Genesis. And that's what the writer is supplying.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating because obviously there's a, like if we read something like that today, I would think most people would assume, oh, like this person is just completely making this up. They're trying to make themselves, I guess, their writing look good. I don't know. But I don't know. Do you think that it was just completely made up by someone, or like it was oral tradition, or what?
Well, I think that, and we have good reason to believe this, the writer was drawing on ways in which Genesis was interpreted over the centuries. We don't know exactly when Genesis was written, but it was around for centuries before this man wrote Jubilees. And so people have been reading it for centuries and interpreting it for centuries, trying to handle some difficulties in the text of Genesis. And we have some examples of this in books that probably were written before Jubilees. For example, in Genesis 6, we have that weird story about the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they chose of them the ones that they wanted, and married them. and had children. And odd names are given to the children in Genesis 6, verse 4. And I think most people, when they read that passage, say, what in the world is going on here? Who are the sons of God? Who are the daughters of men? That they're having these questionable marriages and having unusual children. And one idea that was widespread in antiquity was to say the sons of God are angels and the daughters of men are women. And angels looking down from heaven saw these women, lusted after them, descended, married them, and had gigantic children. And the evil caused through the angels, their children, and so on, eventually led God to send the flood. It was, a way of saying, why did God send the flood? That interpretation is one we find in the book of Enoch, which is earlier than Jubilees, but we find that repeated in Jubilees. So Jubilees has taken that, from an earlier source and used that in his interpretation of Genesis 6. And we have a number of other examples of that, like the treatment that Jubilees gives to Levi, the son of Jacob, who Levi is sort of a negative character in Genesis. He and his brother Simeon slaughtered the people of Shechem after their sister was raped there. And Jacob curses them in Genesis 49 in his last message to his children. But this Levi became the ancestor of the priests somehow. And so naturally people wondered, well, how in the world did this guy with such a slim record and a dubious record, how did he become the ancestor of the priests? So ideas about that arose, and about how Levi really was this virtuous fellow who saved the family of Jacob from intermarrying with the people at Shechem and so on, and that he already became a priest in the time of his father. So, stuff like that was available to the author of Jubilees. He incorporated that. I suspect he also came up with some of his own ideas, about the meaning of the text, but he could certainly draw on tradition.
Mm. Yeah, we also have that the Mastema figure, and would you say that when reading it, it's funny reading it as someone that's like not an expert in any way on this topic, because you're just reading through like stories that you're already familiar with. And like when God calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and then it says that Mastema is the one that kind of like incited that. Maybe I didn't get that correctly, but
No, you did.
Is there any reason to think that Mastema is seen as like the Satan figure in this time period?
Yeah, he is, and he's even called that in Jubilees, it seems, once or twice, although the normal term is the one you use, Mastema, or the Prince of Mastema. But he's obviously the head of the forces of evil, the head of all the evil spirits who are doing their thing in the world. But as you indicated, in Genesis 22, when Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac, Genesis just has God giving him that order, go to this place, sacrifice your son. And you don't get any explanation. Well, why did God say such an awful thing? Well, Jubilees puts this figure Mastema in there, that he's the one who really gave the idea, raised the challenge to God. Does Abraham serve you for nothing? Like Job, like the Satan in the book of Job asks, does Job serve you for nothing? Works out pretty well for him. So the test comes from him. The same thing happens when we're up to the story of the plagues in Exodus. In the book of Jubilees, it's the forces of Mastema are involved in the plagues. It's an attempt to say, it wasn't God's fault. God didn't do something wrong, but it was Mastema who actually did this. That's the way we have to understand that. And that God just used these occasions to show Mastema up, that he was wrong, to defeat him.
That's really interesting. So I've heard different thoughts on, the first thing is like, okay, the person was just trying to defend God essentially. Like they didn't want
Mhm.
God to look bad essentially.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I've heard other theories that it's more of a, you know, the writer's thinking, well, surely God wouldn't do that. So it
Mhm.
had to be something else. And we see this other part in Job where we've got the Satan figure. So it must be that same figure, which of course he's called Mastema in this phrase.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on like the distinction there? Like, or do we have any idea
Yeah.
behind the
Well,
thought
we don't
process maybe?
know. Yeah, we don't know for sure, of course, how these ideas got started.
Mm,
Um, we do know that they're present in early sources, so that they must have been satisfying explanations for some people at an early time. But I suspect, we can surmise that
mm,
such ideas arose because people said, well, we know what God is like, what he's really like, how he's revealed himself. So
mm,
we don't think he could actually tell Abraham to sacrifice his son. There must be more to this story. And
hmm.
then calling on the parallel with the book of Job, which is what Jubilees does. It very much parallels the sacrifice of Isaac's story with material from Job, because it, as in the book of Job, we have the the sons of God going back and forth in the earth, and they come back and report to God what they see, and the Satan is among them. And he says, and God asks him, well, have you seen my servant Job, how great he is, and so on. Satan says, well, of course you give him everything. Why shouldn't he be? Test him. Well, that's exactly the situation Jubilees has for Abraham, that Mastema hears these things said about how great Abraham is, and he raises these very questions. And he says, "Well, um, let's see who Abraham loves more, you or his son Isaac, his beloved son Isaac." And we learn from Jubilees. Well, God knew, of course, um, what the truth was of the matter, but He wanted to show Mastema. That's why He put Abraham through this, and it somewhat mitigates the horrors of that story. Not entirely, I think.
Yeah, right.
Just like the Job story is very hard to figure.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so there's obviously a lot of differences between, Genesis, Exodus, and the Torah, and then how it's portrayed in the Book of Jubilees. What could you, I don't know, talk about some, I don't know, a couple more interesting things that are just really fascinating, like, I don't know, like why would it be added there, or what could be the writer saying? I don't know. What comes to mind when you think about these like major differences there?
Well, one of the major kinds of differences is that Jubilees has Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob obeying a lot of laws that we know only from the law of Moses, the laws that were revealed to
Mm-hmm.
Moses at Mount Sinai and afterwards. According to the author, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob already obeyed and knew many of these laws. And so we get in Jubilees a tradition, apparently going all the way back to Adam, that God progressively reveals his laws, to these patriarchs. And they write them down and pass the books in which they write them down to the next generation. And we have this mention for Noah, for example, for Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, all the way down to Levi. So there's a written tradition, according to the author, of laws already back in Genesis, um, laws that, according to the Bible, were revealed only in Moses' time. So the patriarchs are good law-abiding people. They don't know all the laws, but they know many more than we would guess from Genesis. And among them are laws about the festivals, the holidays that we read about in the Bible, like Passover couldn't very well be celebrated by the patriarchs because it's so tied to the Exodus from Egypt. They really couldn't be. Although the story about the sacrifice of Isaac uh, is tied very much to Passover imagery, and the near sacrifice of Isaac occurs right when the lambs would be sacrificed for Passover later on. But Noah already celebrates the Festival of Weeks, or Pentecost. And this is told about in Jubilees chapter 6 already, that he celebrates that festival, which becomes the festival on which all the covenants in Genesis are made, the Festival of Weeks, or Pentecost, and also with the Festival of Tabernacles. So all the major festivals already were celebrated by the patriarchs. And it really gives you the impression that it was important for the author to present them as law-abiding, because you could easily look at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy and say, well, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived really before the law. They were not law-abiding people because they didn't have the law, and the law came on at a later time. And I think when Jubilees was written, some people were saying that, yeah, that's the case. There was this golden age when the patriarchs didn't obey all these laws that make us different than other people. They didn't obey kosher laws and things like that. They didn't have Sabbath laws. So why should we have all these laws? Why don't we be like the patriarchs and look like everybody else? And I think Jubilees says, oh no, that's not true. They did obey laws. You just have to read it properly. And so every time there might be a suggestion in Genesis about a law being known or possibly connected with a situation, the writer jumps on it, like the Sabbath law and
For sure.
the beginning of Genesis 2, with God resting on the seventh day. So that certainly stands out when you read the book, how important laws are already in the life of the patriarchs. And as is typically the case with the author of Jubilees, he picks up on little hints in the text. We have a couple of passages in the Abraham stories in Genesis where it talks about Abraham keeping my statutes and ordinances and things like this. So you wonder, well, what are they? What are the statutes and ordinances Abraham would have kept? He knew about the law of circumcision, but that was about it, for him. But according to Jubilees, it points to a lot more law keeping and knowledge on the part of Abraham.
Really, really interesting. It just reminds me of questions like, how do we see Abraham as righteous
Mm-hmm.
if he didn't have the laws?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, that kind of solves the problem in a bit of a roundabout way.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, these sorts of things can get you into some really basic questions. Right. How, we have that story in Genesis 15 of God making the covenant with Abram at that point. And Abram believes, and it was counted to him as righteousness. It's just believing apparently did it there, but was there nothing else, to Abraham? Is that all he ever did? He clearly obeyed when it was time for circumcision, but otherwise we don't have much about that to justify his being righteous.
Mm-hmm.
And all those debates that we get in Galatians and so on about
Right.
law and faith and things like that. You get involved in these kinds of issues.
Mm. Isn't there a portion of Jubilees where it talks about how Abraham only worshipped one God?
There is. This is an example of Jubilees problem solving, because at the end of the book of Joshua, there's a reference to how God says to Joshua, your ancestors served other gods behind the river, and it mentions Abraham's father and Abraham as being among those, and it makes it sound like he was an idolater at some point. And that's something that gets developed in different Jewish books. Well, how was he an idolater? How was Abraham an idolater? And in the story in Jubilees is that when Abraham and his family, his father Terah and his brothers, were in Ur of the Chaldees at the beginning of Abraham's life, his father was a priest at the temple of the local god. So he was a priest of an idol, and at the temple there. And this is the family that Abraham is born into, according to Jubilees. And already as a child, it says he became aware, God acting on him, became aware that there's something wrong with this, that there's really only one God, and these idols are really helpless. And the story is that Abraham burned the temple of the idols. And his brother, who died before Abraham, his brother Aaron, died trying to save the idols, which was it's kind of an ironic statement of someone trying to save a god rather than the other way around. But Abraham already at this time is showing that he's against the idols and comes to believe in the one true God, and that leads up to his call to go to Canaan and so on, and the covenants that follow. So again, our writer knows all this stuff that's in the book, in the Bible. Like the end of Joshua, that statement about Israel's ancestors being idolaters, and feels he has to deal with them, and does so, apparently in a traditional way.
Very fascinating. All right, so last question for you. Is there anything else any other ideas that you just find really fascinating about the text that people might be interested in?
Yeah. I think that one issue that may not be so obvious at first is an issue that I think our writer took seriously, the writer of Jubilees, is that you could pick up Genesis and just read along in it as we do, and never ask yourself, who's telling me this story? Who's telling me about the creation, and how would that person know something that would have happened so long ago? And who's telling me about Adam and Eve and about Abraham and Noah and all that? I think the author of Jubilees took this quite seriously. Nothing is said in Genesis about who wrote Genesis. Moses becomes the traditional author. He's associated with laws in Exodus, of course, and so the idea arose that he wrote laws, and there are some references to Moses writing stuff, but nothing in Genesis or Exodus says that he wrote that history that we find in Genesis in the first part of Exodus. So Jubilees takes that issue up and tells you exactly what the situation was. That gives you the story about creation and how the writer would know this stuff. So he, as I mentioned earlier, the angel of the presence dictates to Moses all this stuff that's written on the heavenly tablets. So this is where it comes from, and this is why you should believe it. It's on this authoritative source. Tablets in heaven. The whole stuff, all this stuff is etched on the tablets of heaven. So you can rely on this. An angel revealed it to Moses. Moses is reliable. He wrote it down. So this is the straightforward stuff. And the author really puts a lot of emphasis on the authority of what he's writing, and that you really should accept this is the proper way to read the book of Genesis. You need help like this to read it properly, and not read it like people who were saying there was this golden age when nobody obeyed laws, and now we're obeying all these silly laws that make us different from everyone else. He's just saying, no, that's not the way you should read this stuff. And he's speaking with authority.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating when we look at it in our day and age, when you have a whole bunch of scholarship that's the scripture was not dictated in any way. And then you have, especially in the fundamentalism and liberal scholarship that the past 100, 200 years with that topic.
Yeah.
But then you have someone so early proposing that at least the Book of Jubilees was straight dictated.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
it's really fascinating. It's almost like they had that same intuition then, at
Yeah.
least.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
It's
very
really
explicit
fascinating.
about it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's all I got for you today. This has been really interesting to talk about. Uh, Once again, could you point people to some resources where they can find more about you? And uh, any other last thoughts on the topic together?
Well, I encourage people to read this kind of material. I think you'd find it interesting not only in itself, but also for things it makes you think about in the Bible itself. How this author was already very much aware of some issues that could be raised by the book of Genesis and was attempting to address them. One obvious little issue was, according to, if you read the creation story carefully in our Bibles, it says that God completed creation on the seventh day. And this, of course, would indicate that God had violated the very first Sabbath day. And Jubilees and the Samaritan Pentateuch and other texts make sure that it says he completed everything on the sixth day. But it's just a little thing, that these people noticed in the text, and they wanted to make sure you didn't draw the wrong conclusions about it. But one little thing that I could mention in closing here about the New Testament, according to Jubilees, Abraham spent a lot of time instructing Jacob. And we don't have anything about this in Genesis. There's no contact between Abraham and Jacob in Genesis. But if you look at the chronology, Abraham was 100 years old when he became the father of Isaac. And Isaac was 60 years old when he became the father of the twins, Jacob and Esau, which would have made Abraham 160 at that time. And Abraham lived to be 175, according to Genesis. So there were 15 years when Abraham could have interacted with Jacob and Esau. Genesis doesn't talk about any such thing, but Jubilees does. And I think we have a reflection of this in Hebrews 11, where it talks about Abraham living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, that Abraham did have contact with Jacob, and as the chronology of Genesis suggests he could have. And Jubilees and other texts elaborate on this sort of thing. So that you can pick up things from Jubilees to help you even to read the New Testament, I think. That's just one small example.
Really, really fascinating. Cool. Somewhat just thought to me came to me. So as I was reading, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Genesis 1 describes the first 7 days in the book of Jubilees, and then their interpretation of Genesis 2 is another 7 days of some type of creation. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. It talks about what happens on each of the days in the second week, including showing the animals, to the people. But yes, it does. It uses some of the language from Genesis 2 in talking about creation of Genesis 1, like it has the Garden of Eden, for example, made on the day when the plants and so on are created in Genesis. So there's some intermixing of those, but it does, yes, talk about the material in Genesis 2 and 3 in connection with another week.
Huh. Is there any logic to that, or is that just like what could the writer have been thinking there? Do you know?
Yeah. Well, I get the impression that he thinks of there being only one creation, that one sequence of creation, and that what was made, then, what happens after that with the garden, for example, what happens in the garden. So talking about the process of showing the animals to the man, and then after a certain number of days. He's not satisfied with any of these animals as being his mate, and then God makes the woman out of his rib. Jubilees uses this story about the creation of the woman in the second week to tie it to Leviticus 12, which talks about the times of impurity that a woman has after giving birth to a male or a female. And it's kind of a weird passage, but
Yeah.
It's twice as long. Impurity is twice as long for a woman who has a female child as it is for a male. And the writer of Jubilees relates this to how the man was created in the first week, and the woman was at least shown to him, pulled out of his rib, or his rib was pulled out of him and made into the woman in the second week. So that's 2 weeks, the man only 1 week. And so the time for the impurity of a child, a woman giving birth to a child, the writer, by analogy, decided it was twice as long. It took twice as long for the woman to appear. And so this period of impurity is twice as long. Kind of a stretch, you might think, but it was an association that the writer made, and could use this, spelling out the various days in the second week, after the first week of creation, to justify this reading of Leviticus 12.
That is interesting beyond measure. Okay. All right.
Unusual.
Yes, definitely. Anyways, this has been so awesome. I really appreciate you talking with me, and I'm sure a lot of people got a lot of stuff out of this. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you have a great rest of your night, Dr.
Well,
VanderKam.
thank you. I
Awesome.
enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.